The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series and welcome to Unit 5. Warm welcome to you wherever you are in Australia or overseas. Looking forward to working with you. I realise it may not be lunch where you are, but nevertheless we call this Lunch and Learn. Just want to make sure to start with that I'm being heard. Could I ask you just over in the question box to type in the word clear? That would indicate to me that I'm coming across loud and clear, which is very important. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, John. Thanks, Marsha. All good. Thanks, Peter. Great. All right, it's all good. Usual scenario, you'll get the slides, of course, and the presentation at the end. So hopefully you've had a chance to do your homework. And anyway, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. I also hope, of course, that you've had a chance to complete the diagnostic that I sent you, because what I'm doing in this session is I'm going to do a debrief on that diagnostic on understanding people and their personalities. And it's quite an enlightening, fun session, and it obviously helps if you've done it. There's nothing you can do about it now if you haven't, but I guess the point is that if you haven't done it, then I suggest you do this as soon as you can after the presentation, and then it'll make a lot of sense to you. All right, so let's get underway and look at where we're up to in the whole program. And you'll notice, of course, that we're up to Module 5, so we're well on the way. And last time we met, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about getting the very best from people. So that was all around attempting to use different motivational strategies to get the best out of people. But the essence of that was that we should be giving people autonomy, we should be helping them achieve mastery, and we should be explaining to them the purpose of what they're doing. These are the three. That was the essence of what Unit 4 was all about. Okay, so we're going to talk about people today and how they might we might best relate to them from a personality perspective. And then the last unit in 2 weeks' time will be very much on facilitating effective meetings, which of course is a critically important topic because we're all spending a lot of time in meetings, and the worse the meetings are, of course, the more we're wasting time. So we'll spend some time on that next time. Nevertheless, let's talk about personality. So I hope you've had a chance to practice autonomy, mastery and purpose in your leadership decisions, as I mentioned, and I'm hoping that you are starting to think more about those issues. Bear in mind, I realise that we've got a lot of people in this Lunch and Learn today, and I know that not all of you are working with what we call knowledge workers. Many of you are working in sort of semi-skilled or perhaps even unskilled occupations, and that always, as we mentioned last time, maybe the carrot and the stick does work very well, but in most cases, with a reasonably educated and skilled workforce, people want to feel that they're given the freedom to make decisions and choices in their own way. They want to be given the opportunity to develop themselves and the skills that they need in order to do their job, and they want to know the purpose of their work and how that links, or what the line of sight is between the work that they do and the end result, the outcome. So that's what people want, and that's what they need. And our job as leaders, of course, is to give them exactly what they need and want in order to get the very best from them. And as I mentioned last time, really getting the best out of people is not taking people necessarily from a performance standard of a 4 to a 10, which might be unrealistic, at least in the short term. What we're really talking about, getting people from a 4 to a 5, or a 6 to a 7, or a 7 to an 8. That's really what we're on about, and that's what you should be aiming for, because exponentially, if you do that, you're going to get enormous results as such. All right, so let's move on to today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about personality to start with, and a little bit of the psychology behind that. Then I'm going to talk about the actual personality profile that I got you to do, and I designed it around 4 animals, which make it a little bit simpler to understand. I think sometimes when you do these personality profiles, it's really hard to categorize what it is that you come out as. It could be, MBTI or any of those sorts of processes. So I've just simply made it 4 animals: an owl, a bull, a lamb, and a peacock. So you'll find that when we think about an owl, a lamb, a bull, or a peacock, we get a pretty quick image of what sort of personality we're talking about. Obviously, it's about application as a leader. So how do we talk to people that perhaps don't think like us and don't have the same personality? So what do we need to emphasize in order to get, because every single one of us who is in this broadcast today, including me, has and will continue to have personality conflicts with people, right? That's just the way it works. But the question then is, it's often the reason that we have those personality conflicts is because we are looking at the world differently through different eyes. And if we can at least empathize and understand how other people see the world, we can shape our particular presentation and the way we do things around to accommodate that personality type. And we're going to talk about the platinum rule. And the platinum rule, of course, is treat people how you want, or sorry, I should start again. The platinum rule is treat people how they want to be treated. You might be aware that the golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated, not necessarily applicable in this case. All right, so that's where we're going in the next hour, so buckle in and away we go. The normal process is, if you've got questions or comments, you know what to do. Go to the question box and type them in, and I will respond to them as we go through the presentation. And I do encourage you, because that's a way that we can keep this interactive so that it's not just me contributing for the full hour. I'm happy to do that, but I think you've got something to say about these things as well. So let's just talk about personality for a moment. And I guess, the important thing that we're trying to get out of this session is to provide you with a fun and practical tool for understanding yourself and others. That's essentially what this is all about. But personality, the word personality, comes from the Greek word persona, which essentially means mask. So basically what personality is a mask. Now, it's not a physical mask, of course, but it's a mask that we wear to protect ourselves against the world. And so all of us have a predisposition to a sort of mask or a way we protect ourselves in the world. Now, the big question, of course, is what do these masks look like? And second question is, where do these masks come from? So, for example, are people born with a personality, as some people think? Are people actually, do personalities come from our environment, as others think? Can personality change, or is personality pretty much set? They're all questions that all of us are interested in. I guess the bad news is there aren't definitive answers about those questions. So therefore, it's quite complex, but there are lots of theories about it anyway. So I'm happy to share with you some of my views. So 20 years ago, there was a view, maybe longer than that, let's say 40 years ago, there was a view that you were a product of your environment. So in other words, your personality was a result of how you were shaped by your environment. And probably, in the order of, say, about 15 years ago, that whole concept was turned on its ear. And there was a view that personality was an innate quality. It was something that you were, there was some sort of an innate quality that you'd have. You were sort of born with a personality, if you like. And if those of you who've got young children, and you can see clearly that they have a fairly well-formed personality at a very young age, and you kind of think, well, where did that come from? It's not necessarily that they inherited it from you, but they've kind of had a personality predisposition that they were born with. So I think there's some validity to that. And then, of course, the latest research, it's only been around in the last 5 years, is suggesting that personality is something that can morph and change as we go through life. So, scans of the brain that shows that the brain is continually growing and reshaping itself would tend to suggest that personality is malleable and can change as well with our life experiences and so forth. So we've done the full circle basically, and it's really up to you as to what your view is about that. I personally think that personality is pretty much a set predisposition. In other words, when you and I are stressed, what happens is that our personality becomes stronger, or a mask. The mask becomes thicker. Why? Because that's our way of protecting ourselves from the world. And so, therefore, if you're a very detailed person, you will tend to be very, very detailed and make lots of lists under pressure. Or if you're a very talkative person, an outgoing, gregarious person, it's likely that you will talk a lot and to other people when you're under pressure and so forth. So I think, it's a protective mechanism, and I don't personally, this is only my view, and others would dispute this, and I'd be keen to hear what you've got, but I think what happens is that it's there to protect us essentially from the world, and so therefore, because it's a protection mechanism, it's very much set, and what we need to do is to work with it. We can shape it and we can mold it, but essentially the motivations behind the personality are pretty much set. So these are the four animals that you'll see on your screen right now, and you can see that you've got an owl, you've got a lamb, you've got a bull, and you've got a peacock. So when you do the personality profile that I gave you, you'll find that you'll have 4 scores in each of these columns. It takes a little while to do, of course, but once you end up with those 4 scores, the first important thing to note about this is that nobody, I would imagine, would have got 40 points in one column, right? I mean, that just doesn't happen. You don't get 0, 0, 0, 40. It's highly likely that you're a mix of all 4 personalities, and so am I. And when Carl Jung, who was the first psychologist to come up with the notion of personality type in the last century, it was highly controversial and still is to a certain extent. And people think that, you can't categorize people pigeonhole people into these groups. But where you had a relatively high score, that is your highest score, it's probably likely that the traits, and you would have seen in the handout I did send you, the traits are probably very familiar to you. Now, if you scored 20 points in any of these columns, then clearly that's a very dominant personality type. So when you read the traits, it's probably highly likely that you said, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me, and you would have ticked them all off. But if they're fairly close or even, it's likely that you could fluctuate from one personality type to the other, depending on who you're dealing with or what the situation is. So those things can be dependent on your scores. So let's have a look at the profile and how it works, and then, of course, as I said before, we'll then do some application work and what you can do. So obviously, as I go through this, think about some of the people that you're leading and some of your colleagues at work, and think, well, where would they fit in this 2x2 matrix? So you can see on your screen you've got owls, bulls, lambs, and peacocks. Now the first dimension is introvert and extrovert. Now we've all heard these terms before, and they sometimes get overused, and they certainly get abused, and they don't get used the right way. The simple explanation of an introvert and an extrovert is this, and it's the true explanation. What it really means is that it's how you recharge your batteries. So if you're more inclined to be introvert, you will tend to recharge your batteries, re-energize yourself, in other words, by thinking and being on your own. All right? And the opposite's true. If you're more extrovert, you will recharge your batteries or energize yourself with and through other people, talking, engaging in conversation with other people. Now, I know many of you would probably be smack bang in the middle between introvert and extrovert. It might depend on how many drinks you've had or what you've been, it could be a range of things. But at the end of the day, most of us have a predisposition towards introversion or extroversion. And that's all it is. It's an energizing thing. Now, the truth is, there's a lot of rubbish that's written about this, and that introverts lack confidence and extroverts are confident, and leaders are more extrovert than introvert, and that extroverts have got better people skills, and all of this stuff is rubbish. And you need to disband all that, because it's just about how you like to recharge your batteries after after the batteries have run down. Now, if you want to know whether you've got a predisposition to introversion and extroversion, it's very simple. If you've got your profile in front of you, if you just add up your owl and your lamb score, just add up the two columns, and those would be the last two columns on that page where you've got your scores. If you add up those two scores, you'll get a score for introvert, and if you add up your bull and your peacock score, you'll get a score for extrovert. And of course, whichever's the highest will determine which you are. So if you've got a predominantly higher score on the bull and the peacock collectively, then you're more extrovert than introvert. So that's the first interesting dimension in the profile. The other dimension that's important is down on the right-hand side. We have task-focused and people-focused. So in other words, task-focused is the focus is on getting the task done first and foremost. So owls and bulls are very task-focused as personalities, and the lamb and peacock are very people-focused. In other words, dealing and working in a team and with other people is the critically important determinant. And once we've determined all that, I'm happy to get on and get the task done. So obviously they're both important, because in the business world that we work in, things have to be done. So we've got all sorts of tasks to do, but also there are lots and lots of people we've got to interact with, all sorts of stakeholders. So we've got to do both. But it's likely that your profile shows a predisposition towards task or people. Now, how do you know? Well, if you add up your owl and your bull score, and you add up your lamb and your peacock score on that scoring page, and whichever has the aggregate higher score will tell you whether you're more task or people focused. And that can be very interesting. And, you may, for example, if you're very task focused, building rapport and chit chat and all the rest of it's probably not something you're all that interested in. You just want to get the job done, and then you can do all the rapport building and chit chatting you'd like. But on the other hand, if you're very people focused, you've got to feel a reasonable level of comfort with the people that you're working through before you're at your productive best. So, these things are very real in terms of what we do. Now, what these gives us four particular personality types. Owls, which are introvert and task focused. Lambs, that are introvert and people focused. Bulls, that are extrovert and task focused. And peacocks, that are extrovert and people focused. All right, so that's the first interesting thing about the profile. It shows you where you sit and what each category means. Now, what I'm going to do now is I want to spend a bit of time actually deconstructing each of these personality types. And I want to use some famous people that we know to really sort of highlight the personality type. All right, so yeah, Peter, I will resend the test, no drama whatsoever. So yeah, I'll make sure I put that in the email. All right, so anyone that hasn't done it, you can get to do that when I send it out to you. All right, so let's look at the peacock to start with. Now, these are in order on your profile. So if you have a look at your profile, you'll notice that the peacock is in the first column for no other reason other than it's there. So, I'm not putting it there because it's the best or the worst or anything like that. All four of these personalities have strengths, and all four of these personalities have opportunities for growth. So what's the motivation for the peacock? Well, peacocks, you'll notice them in the room because they usually have the loudest laugh and usually the brightest clothes, and you won't miss them. Their primary motivation is being popular. Now, what I mean by that is it doesn't mean these all are ideals. No one can ever be popular with everybody all the time. It's not possible. But the peacock really does strive to be reasonably popular. They do and get invited to lots of parties and so forth. So this is a key attribute of the peacock. And if you've got one in your team, you'll know them. You'll know instantly because you'll recognise them. And they've always got a joke. They've always got some form of entertainment, and usually they might be the social director of the team. So they're pretty obvious who they are. Their characteristics, as you could probably imagine, are extrovert, so they're outgoing and normally, so they enjoy being around people, and normally what happens is that's how they energize themselves, is being with and around people. They're talkers, so they enjoy the whole idea of talking. Sometimes, of course, they do too much talking, and sooner or later they realise that sometimes they've got to shut up and give other people a chance to say something. And of course, they see the glass as half full, not half empty. So they're pretty much optimists, and so naturally optimistic about the future. But that they're the key traits. So what their strengths are in many cases is that there is a tendency that they have an appealing personality. So they are fun to be around. One of my best friends is clearly a peacock, and you couldn't think of anything better to do than have a cup of coffee with them, because they'll always have something entertaining to talk about. Usually they're quite creative and colourful, and they have a high energy level, and they demonstrate a lot of enthusiasm. And in fact, many people would argue that they're very inspiring to be around. So I'm sure we know people like that. Interestingly enough, people in the workforce, the peacock is the one probably of the four personalities that can get away with the most at work. They really do push the envelope, but people kind of just dismiss it and say, oh, that's just Fred, or that's just Mary, and kind of move on from there. So, personalities, famous people. Well, I picked two, and I've tried to be politically correct, a male and a female. I picked Paris Hilton, and she hasn't been sort of in the media too much lately, but I remember years ago she got sent to prison for tax evasion. I don't know if you remember that, but what I thought was interesting about that exercise is that she made that a publicity stunt. So I think most of us, if we ended up in prison, would probably just quietly do our time and come out the other end. But no, she had to make it a publicity stunt so that people kind of knew that she was going into prison. And of course, Billy Connolly, the famous Scottish comedian. I mean, if you've ever seen him in action, he just goes from one subject matter to the next. He's hilarious. There's no structure. There's no method to his madness. He's all over the place. But nevertheless, he's extremely funny. And, he enjoys clearly being on stage, and he enjoys performing. And this is the peacock trait. So they are very, the typical Hollywood movie star, for example, is a peacock. So they worry about not being in the gossip columns. That's the most important thing, not whether what they say is accurate, but it's more that they are in the gossip columns. So there's a couple of people that you might like to think about as peacocks, male and female. So their particular I guess their motivation, or the way they think about the world, is that any publicity is good publicity. That's how they think. And of course, that's the old Mae West comment many years ago of a famous actor who said any publicity is good publicity. So that's how the peacock thinks. Okay, so I wonder if any of you are peacocks. Maybe you could tell me. I'm sure you won't hold back in telling me. So you can type it in if you are. Everyone's gone quiet. All right, the bulls. I'm sure we've got some bulls in this Lunch and Learn series. Let's talk about the bull as a personality type. Their primary motivation is being powerful. Now, the reality again, just like being popular, these all start with P, is that you can't always be powerful. But the bull has a great fear of being taken advantage of, and that's why they like to be in dominant situations, because that worries them about being put in a situation where they're subservient to something else. And so the truth is that they're always striving to be in control, if you like. And that's so you can imagine that the bull is a reasonably dominant personality type. And again, you'll know who the bulls are in your team. They're the ones who pretty much want to take things over, take on responsibilities and get things done. Not too good on the small talk, not too sentimental, but will pretty much be very task focused and often will get things done. They might be a bit rough and ready, but things will get done. So, like the peacock, they are extroverts, they are doers. So the bulls are people who, usually have several balls in the air at once, juggling, and sometimes they drop one or two of them, but generally speaking, they bite off more than they can chew. But they are very task focused, as I mentioned earlier. And again, like the peacock, the glass is half full, not half empty. So they tend to be quite optimistic about things. So if we think about some of their strengths, they are born leaders. Now, I don't mean that they are perfect leaders, because sometimes the bull might think they are, but really of the four personalities, they are the personality that feels most naturally inclined to leadership roles. So that's the bull. And so whereas the owls, the lambs and the peacocks will feel some fear or trepidation in being the leader, the bulls will tend to feel charged by that because it's fulfilling their need for power, as I mentioned. So here's two people that come to mind. And incidentally, people often ask me and say, well, is there any difference between gender? Absolutely not in relation to personality. All right, if you could divide the world up into four categories, owls, bulls, lambs and peacocks, generally speaking, you would find equal numbers of males and females in each of these categories. So just thought I'd mention that. But two people that come to mind very readily are Madonna, the famous musician, and Hillary Clinton, of course, who recently, or relatively recently in 2016, fought the presidential campaign against Donald Trump. Now, both of those two are very powerful personalities. You don't want to mess with them. Madonna, for many years, built her own career, and she, was through dogged determination, got to the top of her profession, and still is pumping out albums. And she's, you don't want to mess with her. Nor would, of course, you would want to mess with Hillary Clinton either. And we've seen her in action on the campaign trail. And both of those are clearly people who like to be in control, who are very task focused, and fits the bill quite nicely of what I was mentioning before. Their motto in life is that I'm in control and I'm willing to lead. So that's essentially how they think about things. So I wonder if we have any bulls, or anyone would like to admit. Do you want to just type into the question box whether you are a bull? Do you have any of that trait in you? And I should say to you that, my primary, I'll get to that because, I do have a little bit of bull in me, I must admit, but I'm not excessively a bull. So the owl. Now we're moving to a different quadrant now, because this is more on the introvert side, whereas the bull and the peacock were more extrovert. The owl and the lamb are more introvert. So let's have a look at this personality type. Now the owl, their primary motivation in life is to be a perfectionist. Now there is no such thing as perfection, but of course the owl is striving all the time to be perfect. And in fact, this can be a great thing, a double-edged sword, and it could be a negative thing. They're always striving. So often they will take too much time getting things done because they're trying to do it perfectly. And I've got a little bit of this in me. There's no question about this. I've learned to let go a lot of it in my in my years, but still there is a bit of that in me without a doubt. So their characteristics, excuse me, their characteristics are they're an introvert. So the glass is half introvert. They enjoy their own company more perhaps than the company of other people. They're thinkers, so often very deep thinkers. And I remember talking to someone the other day who was an owl, and I was doing some coaching with them, and I said, "How are you going?" They said, "Fine." I said, and then she said, "Oh, there's something funny happened to me this morning." And I said, "What happened?" She said, "Well, call him Fred. Fred came up to me and said hello." And I said, "What's funny about that?" And she said, "Oh, very unusual because Fred's never done that before." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, there's something strange going on there." I said, "Well, maybe Fred was just in a good mood because the owl has a tendency to overthink." And the pessimist, the glass is half empty, not half full. So now owls will often look at how, they're very risk averse. They'll look at how, they'll look at plans. They'll be able to pick holes in various, and of course they can come across as quite negative. But if it's harnessed correctly, they can be very, very useful as because they have actually thought through carefully what the pitfalls of a proposal or an idea are. So their strengths are they love their schedules, and of course if you're an owl and I just decided not to, if I decided to just plough on after the top of the hour, I think you'd be a bit upset because you know that there's an hour schedule for this, or if I started late or something, that wouldn't probably suit you. Of course, anyone could be upset with that, but the owls would be particularly upset with that. The owls have high standards, and this is important to understand that not only do they have high standards of everybody else around them, they also have very high standards of themselves. So they put themselves under enormous pressure, and nobody is harder on an owl than an owl. So they themselves are very, very tough on themselves. So they can be very critical of other people, but trust me, they're very critical of themselves as well. They're very orderly and organised, not necessarily neat and tidy, but they're very orderly and organised. So they get, they've got plans and schedules and to-do lists, and things are put in boxes and places and so forth. So very much along those lines. I'm sure you could think about people in your workplace that fit that bill if that's not you. So a couple of famous people that might help us understand. Well, Roger Federer, the great tennis player. Now, Roger Federer is a perfectionist. Roger Federer, what is he, 38 or something, and he's still at the top of his game. You can't do that unless you are absolutely dedicated to your sporting craft, and clearly Roger Federer is. And there's a very famous YouTube video of him asking people to put a bottle on their head, an empty bottle, and he stands back about 20 metres, and with his tennis racket and ball, he hits the ball, knocks the bottle off the person's head, does it twice. Incredible skills, and works extremely hard, obviously, still at his game. And I know we've got quite a lot of golfing enthusiasts in the presentation today, and I'm sure you could think of many golfers who have this trait. Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist, Leonardo da Vinci, of course, is not around, but you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that he did these sketches of the human body that we probably saw when we were at school. And what I found really interesting when I was studying or reading about Leonardo da Vinci is that what he did, believe it or not, he would actually go into graveyards, and I'm sure you couldn't get permits in those days, you wouldn't need to from the local government, but they go in and he'd dig up some bodies, would you believe, and he'd dissect them, because what he was trying to do is to study and depict the perfect muscular structure so that he'd get it right in his drawings. That's pretty obsessive, isn't it? So there's Leonardo da Vinci being an absolute perfectionist, and there's no question that if he was here today and did the survey, he would come out clearly as an owl. So owls do have some creative or artistic tendency, and if you're an owl, it's probably likely that you have some of that. And if you don't, then you should probably investigate that further, because it's a very real possibility that you have some creative energy. And your motto in life is that, how can I paint this perfect picture? So you're thinking all the time about, what can I do to make to do this in the perfect possible way. And of course, there's no such thing, and it just can drive you mad. And so owls are the most sensitive of all four personalities, and when you criticize them, they take it to heart and will often sulk, and they can brood for days or months or weeks, or it can go on for periods of time. So if you're one of those, you'll understand that, of course, as I do. And finally, let's talk about the lamb. Now, the lamb personality, their primary motivation is to be peaceful. Now, again, it's impossible for complete peace. Two people on a desert island, and there's going to be some conflict at some point. So really, there's no such thing as, it's utopian to think there'll always be peace. But what the lamb is trying to do all the time is to try to find, a peaceful solution. So they don't like to rock the boat. They certainly are conflict averse, and look, on the flip side, they're nice and engaging to be around. They're certainly not in any way, shape, or form offensive, or certainly not try to be, at least. So their characteristics are that they're introvert. So like the owl, they are watchers rather than thinkers. So what they will tend to do is they will participate in meetings after everyone else has had a go, and they feel it's safe, they'll jump in and give their point of view. Like the owl, they are pessimists. So very risk averse again, and they will tend to see that the glass is half empty rather than half full. So that's very true for them. Their strengths. Now, as a personality, they're very competent and steady. So if you give a lamb a job, they'll tend to get it done, as long as they're very clear about what you expect of them. They're peaceful and agreeable, so they're not likely to rock the boat. And often they're very, very good with clients and stakeholders. And they're very good at seeing two sides of a story. They're good at mediating. So often, because they don't want to take sides, they're often able to navigate their way through conflict and see two sides of a story, which is very, very useful in certain situations in the workplace. And of course, two famous people, and I've picked two actors here, and these two actors are not interested in the limelight of Hollywood, but of course they're both great actors. I'm sure you'd recognise them. Keanu Reeves, The Matrix Mode, and of course many other movies as well, and Kirsten Stewart. Now, both of those two are really not interested in the Hollywood limelight, but both of them are perfectionists in their craft, and both of them are very private people. And, we don't know much about either of them, but what they try and do is just quietly get on with their craft, but yet they're working in a world of publicity. So it's often a source of frustration for both Reeves and Stewart. But I'm sure you'd recognise those qualities in them as actors. So not all Hollywood actors, of course, are peacocks. And that's a bit of a myth to suggest that. But the so-called movie star types, the ones that enjoy the red carpet, clearly they are very much in that peacock realm. So their motto in life as a peacock, their motto in life as a lamb, is peace is the overriding objective. So they're doing everything in their powers to try to maintain the peace and not rock the boat. So they will have a tendency perhaps not to speak up in meetings. They'll have a tendency not to confront people, and they'll have a tendency to smooth things over. And that can be very useful in its own way. So I wonder if you're a lamb. I wonder if you've thought about that one. So any questions, guys? Any comments, any observations that you'd like to make? Now's your chance over on the right-hand side under the question box. Happy to take any questions, any comments, any observations. While you're thinking about that, it's interesting that if you've got a group of people that you're giving, say, a presentation to, it's likely that you're going to have all four personalities in the group. It's a bit like the influencing capabilities profile we did. And therefore, it means that you've got to be more versatile in terms of how you present, bearing in mind that you've got these four motivations in the room. So it's important for you to make sure you extend all four of those attributes when you're giving a presentation. Now what I want to do towards the end of the presentation for the next, say, 10 or so minutes is I'd like to start to look at how you might deal with these four personalities. So as a leader, you will, if you haven't already, I'm sure you have, be confronted by these four personalities. And when you're with them, it's important to understand what you should and shouldn't do if you're aiming to get the best from that person. Now, where it becomes problematic is where it's an opposite. So, for example, peacocks will often scratch their head and not understand owls, right? And lambs will be perplexed by bulls and vice versa. So this is where the potential conflict can arise, where you've got opposites, polar opposites. And that's where this is very valuable, just talking about some of these traits. So let's have a look at the peacock. So the first thing about the peacock that's important is that we need to recognise that they've got a challenge of following through on things. So they're not completely super organised, and sometimes, sending people email reminders, making sure people are ready for the meeting and so forth, making sure people have done their homework before they're coming to the meeting is very important. So recognising their challenge to follow through and to accommodate that by, giving them a chance to think through what they're doing is very, very important. Realise that sometimes they speak without thinking. So, this is very strange for an owl to understand, but the truth of the matter is the peacock thinks by speaking. So they think aloud, and often they will say things, I'm just thinking aloud here for the moment. So what they tend to do is they will tend to just speak without filtering anything. And because of that, it's quite possible that they'll say things that they've regretted or things that perhaps they shouldn't have said. But the thing that's very admirable about the peacock is they don't dwell on those sorts of mistakes. But I think from your point of view, it's not that they put any great thought into it. They've just blurted out the first thing that they've thought about, and often that's not necessarily the right thing. I think with the peacock, they don't like routine work, and I'm sure you're aware of that. They enjoy variety. They enjoy spontaneity. They enjoy lots of balls in the air at once. So realise that they strive for variety and flexibility. And so, if you can structure their work around that, I think you'll get better results wherever possible to give people that variety and flexibility in their way of doing things. Don't expect them to remember appointments or to be on time, and that's the way it is. So they're not that great at to-do lists. They're not all that interested in calendars. They'll put things in, but they probably won't keep it up necessarily. So you've got to be aware that they can, at times, forget important commitments, and they can be very upsetting for someone that doesn't necessarily think that way. So I guess the point there is that it's important to give them reminders and to, and they'll appreciate that. And you'll appreciate it because it basically means that they won't be late to that meeting. So they don't intend to do that. It's just that they forget because they're pretty much, in the moment, in their thinking. Another trait is be prepared to hear their stories. They'll always have a joke for you, or always have a story, and sometimes it can be extremely entertaining, or it might even be annoying depending on who it is and how you're feeling at the time. But I think if you actually listen to their stories, you will get great results, because obviously what you're doing is giving them some degree of recognition. And by doing that, of course, you're in a position then when you can certainly ask for certain things in return. So, and they're often very good at maintaining morale. Sometimes they can be very annoying as well, like any other personality. So be prepared to listen to their stories. They'll always have a story to tell. As I said earlier on, of all the full personalities, they're the ones that can probably get away with the most at work, because they're just out there, and it'll be very obvious that you're dealing with a peacock. All right, moving right along, let's talk about the bull. So if you're dealing with a bull, so assuming you're not a bull, but you're dealing with one of those as one of your people in your team, what can you do to get the best from them? Okay, a couple of things. First thing is to recognize that they're very comfortable leading. So they actually enjoy the process of leading. Now, that doesn't mean that they're trying to take over the world. It just simply means that they enjoy the process of leading, because by leading, there's less likelihood that they'll be taken advantage of. So if you can give them a sense of responsibility, you can give them a task to do, you can give them something that you want done, it's likely that they'll get it done, and probably get it done very quickly, not necessarily in a terribly planned and systematic way, but they will be able to lead and get it done because they're very task focused. One of the things I strongly recommend that you do when you're dealing with a bull is to insist on two-way communication. I think what happens when you're dealing with a bull is that sometimes it can, in fact, be intimidating, because what the bull will do is, if they feel that there's a vacuum of leadership, so in other words, if you're not stepping up to the plate in your team, the bull will actually take responsibility for doing that, and that in itself can be an issue. So it's very important that you just insist on, and be firm and assertive about it, that there should be two-way communication at all times. And it's very important that you do that. So insist on that. In fact, interestingly enough, the bulls will respect you more so if you stand up to them and let them know what's appropriate and inappropriate. Because psychologically, if you do that, what they're seeing is a mirror image of themselves, and they can actually see somebody that they can respect, because that's the way they are. So instead of taking a step back, which is the natural sort of default position when you're dealing with a bull, you need to step into the arena and just gently but firmly let them know that you insist on two-way communication. The other thing about the bull is they're actually not out to hurt you, and this is a big misunderstanding with the bulls. They don't wear their heart on their sleeve, that's true, but by the same token, they're not there to try and hurt you. So just realise that they haven't thought through, they're not plotting about how they might sort of offend you. It's just something that might be said on the spur of the moment. They don't necessarily make great diplomats. I guess that's the point. They usually call it as they see it. And sometimes calling it as they see it, whilst it might be actually true, which is a trait that can be useful, it could also offend some of the people around them. So, as I mentioned before, it's important to be firm and to the point with the bull. It's also important to realise that they're not noted for outward displays of sentimentality or compassion. Doesn't mean they don't feel those things, it's just that they don't wear their heart on their sleeve. So you will find that they will hide that sort of thing from other people. But you've got to understand that they still might feel it. It's just that by showing it, they put themselves in a vulnerable position potentially. And of course, the bull doesn't want to be put in a vulnerable position. And you can imagine that being the case. Now, the owl, what should you do when you're dealing with the owl? Sometimes they're the most difficult to manage for lots of reasons. Can be very complex, actually. But look, they get hurt very easily. I mean, because they're thinkers, you say something to an owl, they'll interpret it 27 different ways. And they'll think about it over and over and over again. And of course, they'll think the worst. So be careful, be very careful when you say things to the owl. They will make the assumption that you've thought carefully about what you're going to tell them because that's how they think. But of course, you may not have. But do think carefully about what you tell them because they are very good at sulking, and you might find that they might sulk for the rest of the day, the week, or the month, which isn't good for productivity. Realise that they've got their program with a mindset that assesses risk, so they will have already assessed the risk of a plan that you might have, and you might interpret that as being very negative. And it may well seem that way, but what they've done is they've assessed it and they've come up with perhaps some ways and means where it could fall over, but also they've probably even thought further about some ways and means of overcoming some of those risks. So that's where they can become very, very valuable. They be prepared to answer their questions. So, you can't be frivolous with an owl. You need to give them detailed, substantive answers. So when you get asked a question, it's important that you give the full answer and not some throwaway line, because they expect you to have thought through, and they won't respect you if you don't give them a decent answer. Try to keep things to a reasonable schedule, because the owls, remember, one of their characteristics is structure. So they believe in structure. They believe that things should be held to, a structure. So make sure you do that. If you're going to say that the meeting is going to finish at 11 o'clock, make sure it does. Realise that your arguments and opinions need to be backed up. You can't just make statements, sweeping statements. They want to see the evidence. The owls are the ones that will read the fine print. They will read the brochure. They'll absorb the information because they want to get the perfect answer. So you need to give them the information in order for them to be satisfied. Finally, the lamb. So what sort of personality are we dealing with there? Well, realise that they need to be very clear about the direction you're heading. The lambs are not natural goal setters. It's not their forte in life. But if you help them set goals, which is a very reasonable thing to do, and they'll appreciate that. Of course, if you do that for the bull, they won't appreciate it, but the lamb will. And the lamb will do that because they're very clear about the direction that you're heading and what you require. And then, of course, they'll work assiduously to get you to that point. So set them some clear targets to aim for is the way to move with the lamb. So yeah, set up some agreed targets. And you'll notice there's a key word in there, agreed. So the key for the lamb is to set the targets and ask them for their commitment to meet those targets. Because once you've got the commitment of the lamb, they won't want to disappoint you. So what they'll do is they will move heaven and earth to meet those targets because they've made a commitment. And if they don't make that commitment, they'll be in conflict with you potentially, and that's not a good thing to be in conflict with anybody, let alone you. Don't always expect outward signs of enthusiasm. So the lambs they don't always seem like the most excited person in the room, but that doesn't necessarily mean that underneath they're not interested or engaged. Often they are, it's just that they don't show it on their face because, don't forget, primarily they're introvert more than extrovert. So they're not demonstrative in their views and the way they look at things. Now, here's something interesting about the lambs you might like to consider. The lambs, when they put things off, have you noticed that sometimes when you deal with people, they put it in the too hard basket and, they never get it done. Now, it could well be that they are doing that because what they're really saying to you, or they're not saying it really, but what they're really wanting to communicate with you is that I think this is a stupid thing that you've given me to do. And of course, if you said that to your boss, it's going to create some sort of conflict undoubtedly, and that won't do much. So what they do is they quietly put it in the too hard basket. and of course, you know, they're very, very stubborn. But the bull would probably tell you that it's a silly idea, whereas the lamb would just quietly not do it. Just got a statement here. I'll just have a look at that one. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Peter. How do you develop skills to talk to other types of personalities if you're a lamb yourself? Well, I think the trick there, Peter, is to try to accentuate some of these qualities that I'm talking about here. So being assertive, for example, when you're dealing with the bull, or, you know, being prepared to be entertained by the peacock, or, you know, praising the workmanship of an owl. So the key for you is to just accentuate your personality just enough to be a little bit more than you would normally be. And the trick is not for you to treat everyone else like a lamb, because they're not. And so you might find you might get great results. So doing these things that we suggest here, Peter, just, you know, trying these things, you may well get better results. And the other thing with the lamb that's really important, guys, is realize or look for mutual commitments. Now, because the lamb doesn't want to be in conflict, then it's likely that if you look for a commitment that you can both agree on, then it's likely that you'll get a better result, because, of course, that person or that personality type doesn't want to be in a conflict situation. Okay. All right, which pretty much brings us to the end. And if you've got a question or a comment, as Peter did, please type it in, because we've still got a few minutes left before we finish up. But I do want to say this, that we've all heard of the golden rule, and the golden rule is simply this: treat people how you want to be treated. Now, of course, what that's all about is things around respect and dignity and all the rest of it. But in terms of the personality types, we think this rule is nonsense, because if you treat people how you want to be treated, you will only appeal to approximately a quarter of the population. So in other words, the people who think like you, which is your personality type. So the key for you is to apply what we call the platinum rule, which is treat people how they want to be treated. And what that means is that we need to just change and flex and you know, change and flex our personalities just enough so that we can accommodate these other motivations beyond our own. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not talking about being phony here. We're not talking about, you know, being somebody that you're not. It just simply means to just be a little bit more open and flexible in terms of how you lead other people, so that you can accentuate those parts of your personality. Because the truth is, if you haven't done it, you'll find this is the case. But the truth is, you didn't get 40 points in one column and 0, 0, 0 in the others. In other words, we do have the capacity and the potential to be, to accentuate different aspects of our personality depending on who we're leading with. And that's part of being a good leader. So that's what we strongly recommend that you do in terms of that. So we just got a question here. Obviously, this applies for performance conversations as well. Yes, Peter, it does. So with performance conversations, who are you dealing with? What sort of personality type? And then knowing that, what might you do to get the point across as clearly as you can, accommodating wherever possible that personality type, but not compromising the information, of course, that you want to share. So it's a bit of a tricky balance, but certainly not treating people how you would like to be treated in that situation is necessarily the right way to go. Yeah, absolutely. So treat people how they want to be treated. Platinum rule in a performance conversation is the right way to go. Absolutely. All right, that's about it. Your homework. Well, what are you going to do for your homework? Well, I want you to try to approach the people you lead with an emphasis on their personality type. And you can start this afternoon if it's lunchtime where you are. I want you now, after lunch, if you haven't had something to eat, after you come back, I want you to start treating people according to their personality type and have a bit of fun with it. And I think you'll find some very interesting light bulbs will go on when you start treating people according to how they like to be treated. So I want you to be more conscious of that. I want you to have a think. And if you're sitting there thinking, oh, look, I don't know, Fred or Mary, I'm not sure which personality type they are. Probably likely, if you don't know, it's probably because if they did the personality profile, it may well be that they're pretty even across a couple of different categories, in which case it's hard to tell. That would probably explain why that's the case. But nevertheless, that's your homework, and then in a fortnight's time, I'd love to hear your feedback and what you gained from the program. So next time we meet, which is our very last session, we'll be looking at facilitating meetings, knowing full well that that's part of your job is to facilitate meetings. We will certainly look at that, and I want to give you an opportunity to sort of look at ways and means of improving your ability to lead meetings, because if you're not doing it now, guess what? At some point in your career, you will be facilitating meetings. So let's make sure we can do that properly. So thanks, guys. Enjoyed working with you again. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you in a fortnight. Thank you and goodbye.